thanks everyone for coming. Thank you to Hiska, Peter, Studio Generale for inviting me and inviting Eelco Bosch van Rosenthal. Van Rosenthal? Yes, sorry.
I listen to anything.
Adding too many honorifics. So yes, tonight's event will be, I'm Nolan Gertz, Associate Professor of Applied Philosophy here at the University of Twente. If it's not already obvious, I'm not Dutch. So this will be an opportunity for a Dutch journalist to explain my country to me.
No, we're not doing that.
Yes. So it's kind of a reverse of how Americans usually talk to the rest of the world. So it should be an interesting evening. We'll try to have at least 30 minutes for Q&A. So start formulating questions, especially the students in the front row. Yeah. So is there anything else I need to say? No. Okay. Thanks.
Just one caveat: I've always been a tourist in your country.
Yes.
Or I work there, but you have to correct me if I'm wrong about your country.
Okay. Well, that is the American way. So yes, thank you, Eelco, for coming. And for those of you who can't read my shirt, it does say Uncle Sam wants you to go to hell. So I wanted to dress the part. So yeah, so to get things started, easy question, who will be the next president of the United States?
Yeah, easy question. Yeah. I knew that was coming, and it's still unexpected. So I chose journalism as a profession, which, and journalists are always tempted to predict, and we never should predict. I was very wrong in predicting, also I'm afraid publicly, that Trump would not win in 2016. So there's really no good reason to ask me that question.
Right.
But I do understand it. The short and boring, well, first of all, I think these are the most, I don't know if exciting is the word for an American citizen. For you, it's probably not excitement. That's the main emotion. But the most unpredictable elections in at least 20 or 24 years, I would say. And until a little while ago, and I guess I'm still there, I would say that Trump has more hurdles than Biden in the remaining 5 or 6 months. Right now I would say Biden, and in an hour I might say Trump.
Okay, that sounds like most.
That didn't help.
Most Americans would, I think, give the same answer. So let me put it another way. Why should we care?
We as Dutch.
Well, there's human beings on the planet, and then
more and more,
right, and then the people specifically in this room.
Right. Well, I mean, the one answer, I guess, is Ukraine. So if you look at world politics, I mean, America is still the leading superpower in many fields. But when you look at foreign policy, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you go from one president to the other, foreign policy is usually one field where they agree, or where there's where you can draw a line, whether it's about transatlantic issues or the Middle East. Obviously, George Bush bombed Iraq, and everything went south from there. But in general, China policy and everything, it's more or less a continuing thing. With Ukraine, even though you never know with Trump, it might be different. So if Trump would win this election, then the chances of Ukraine being able to withhold the Russians might get smaller. But you never know, because it's Trump. And when it comes to Russia, during his first term, or perhaps his only term, he was very, he seemed friendly to Russia and to Putin, during press conference and interviews and all that stuff. If you look at what the Trump presidency really did when it comes to Russia, it was more of the same. And in some issues, even a little tougher than Obama.
Right.
So even with Russia, which I would say right now, Russia and Ukraine is the most you were asking why would we care? Well, if you just look selfish at why would we care as Europeans, then I guess Russia, Ukraine is the main topic. But with Trump, you never know.
Okay.
We should care because America is the most important democracy in the world, and as a world citizen, you want it, you want a stable U.S.
So you have Wilders recently winning the election here, known informally as Dutch Trump. So what would be the relationship, if Trump wins, what would be the relationship between Wilders and Trump?
Well, the Netherlands, and I noticed that as a Dutch journalist in Washington, is extremely unimportant to any American president. I mean, yes, you get invited when everybody else has already been invited. No, it's true. I mean, but in Europe, the Netherlands is like the third, fourth largest player, and economically, the Netherlands is important for the U.S. But other than that, the Netherlands is not important to the U.S. When it comes to the comparisons, because I've heard that before, Wilders and Trump, I think they have. There's a lot more that they do not have in common than what they have in common. Obviously, they're both populist and they're both right-wing, etc., etc. But Wilders, no matter where you stand on him, he's a skilled politician. You could argue Trump is a skilled politician because he won the elections, but I don't think that makes him a skilled politician, because when it came to actual governing or working with Congress or I don't know, saying smart stuff out loud, he's not a skilled politician. And Wilders is not only the most experienced parliamentarian in the Netherlands, but he's just very skilled. He's very smart. He's asking the right questions in many different formats. So I don't think they have that much in common, actually. And when it comes to cultural issues, Thierry Baudet, who's leader of Forum for Democracy, has more in common with Trump, or at least the Trump wing of the Republican Party, which has now taken over the Republican Party, when it comes to gender, Russia as well, cultural stuff, culture wars and that kind of stuff. But Baudet is not a very influential politician.
Right. So what did you learn about America that you in your experience as a journalist, but also as a Dutch person, when you moved to the U.S.?
What did I learn about America?
Yeah. So I assume you had preconceived notions, but what did you, what surprised you? What did you discover?
So I moved. Well, I moved there in 2007. So in 2007. And I stayed there for 6 years, so I'm already gone for quite a bit, even though I return regularly. And I studied there before. The first time apart from my vacation, but my first really American experience was in '97 when I went to school in Muncie, Indiana. You're from Michigan, so you probably know Indiana. It's the same. They look the same. If I am not insulting you.
I think I drove through it as fast as I could.
Yeah, I would. I would do that. So that was really the Midwest, where and that was a very interesting place to start, basically. A very religious place as well, a place where just the year before, and this was '97, they had their last Ku Klux Klan rally, small but still, and the people were again very religious, the students as well. And at the same time, many women in my dorm, etc., had an abortion, and they were 18 or 19 or 20 years old. So it was my first, the first time I really got to learn the American heartland with all the issues. When I moved then 10 years later to Washington as a correspondent, well, again, professionally, I found out how you realize how unimportant the Netherlands is. When it comes to just relating to Americans, but it's I shouldn't speak about Americans because Americans don't exist. But it was a little harder sometimes to. I mean, they're the most. I guess I should say you are the most welcoming people that I've met, and I travel quite a bit. But up to a point, it's a little harder to to build a longer, a deeper relationship. That took me a little longer. Right now, I wonder if the Dutch are all that different.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. But since the Dutch are, as a Dutchman, you're blunt, because that's what you're born blunt.
Right.
Then we sometimes have to get used to the American politeness, in a sense. Dutch people are always complaining that Americans in the supermarket, they would say, "Have a nice day," or "How are you?" Yeah, and they don't even mean it. They say, "How are you?" And they say, yeah, in the Netherlands, they don't even ask.
Right.
So anyway, it's a very superficial answer to your question, but.
Yeah, for those who haven't been to America, and I don't recommend it. There's
I do.
There's a what's known as Midwestern nice. So again, the hey, how's it going? Have good evening. How you doing? And I have many Dutch colleagues who will go to the U.S. On holiday and come back and tell me, "Oh, everyone was so nice. Why are you so negative about the U.S.?" And I'll say, "Oh, they were lying to you. We're good at faking it." And that's what Midwestern nice means. So the Southern nice is bless your heart.
The Southern nice is really nice.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
But again, basically means go to hell.
Yeah.
And
that's the short sense.
I had a colleague in Michigan when I first started teaching there who told me on my first day, I believe in killing people with kindness. So again, basically saying, like, don't trust me.
Right.
So I'm curious, as a politician,
Careful.
as a reporter trying to talk to politicians, but also trying to talk to members of the public, how were you able to gauge the truthfulness of the people you were talking to?
Of the politicians.
Well, of any American, how would you know, or how do you think you did at gauging the honesty?
Well, yeah, but I'll answer that question, or at least I'll buy some time to think about it. But I don't know if it's that different from interviewing Dutch politicians or Dutch people. I think Dutch and American politicians have the fact that they're both politicians is more of a skill they both have than the fact that they're from separate countries. I don't like interviewing politicians. I do it, but it's because you hardly ever, especially when they're campaigning, you get an honest answer, because they're always crafting an answer that helps them politically. But that's not different in the Netherlands than it is in the US.
Okay.
So in that sense, and so it is easier because I work in several countries, but it is easier to work in the US as a journalist, as a TV journalist. I think that has to do with, well, first of all, the language, because I speak English and I don't speak that many other languages. So that helps. I think the fact that, and I don't know when you had public speaking in class. I've always been told that. Well, many Americans I know they when they're at a very young age, they have to learn how to speak.
Oh, I see.
In elementary school or whatever.
Give a presentation, yeah.
Yeah, more so than I mean, my kids are 8 and 10 years old, and they haven't really learned it. So Americans, I think from childhood on, they're better at public speaking in a sense. And you notice that when you ask somebody a question about, even if it's not as informed, but if you ask people on the streets here about politics, it's not necessarily informed, but it's phrased better. And especially for television, that matters. Television is a very, how do you call it, superficial medium. It's if somebody says brilliant things, but it takes them 3 minutes to say it, then my item is already over, and I can't use it, you know what I mean? So Americans are very tailor-made for TV news.
Yeah, right, that's good.
I didn't mean that as a compliment, it's just...
No, I know. And it's the
I didn't mean it as an insult either, it's just...
I think for a lot of American politicians, running for office is a means to the end of being on TV.
Yeah, but again, I think politicians are the same everywhere. And I'm not saying that politicians or political candidates don't care about the world. Some do. But yeah, if you don't have a huge ego, then you don't want to. Then you don't run for. I mean, everybody in Europe loved Obama, but Obama had the biggest ego. Well, not of them all, because Trump. But
Yeah.
Obama had a big ego.
Yeah.
And whoever becomes our new prime minister, and the fun fact, we have no idea. But that will be a person with a big, well, maybe in this case, he's just picked. Well, anyway.
So I'm curious, again, this idea that you talk to people as a journalist in the United States. I know after in the United States, I see a lot of journalists talking about their newsrooms had a meeting about how to cover Trump and how to not repeat the mistakes of 2016. Mm-hmm. Did NewsHour have a similar meeting?
You mean during this election year?
Yeah.
No, not yet. Not
Okay.
yet. But if we were an American outlet, we definitely would have. But we don't. Obviously, NewsHour is it's people in the Netherlands know it, but we're not a factor in the elections there. During the Dutch elections, I'm not a political journalist, but I'm sure we've had that discussion about how to cover Wilders, etc. But the Trump years and the Trump campaign back then and now again are a stress test in a sense for American journalism, obviously. So I understand very well that every American newsroom did have these conversations. And I think many of them fall into the same traps as they did in 2016, but I think some lessons have been learned. For instance, I think all of the Trump rallies, so when Trump speaks, it will take 2 hours, whether it's in Georgia or Wisconsin or whatever. And in 2016, he was such a novice on the political stage that all these speeches would be aired live. And I don't think the American outlets do that anymore, even though it's probably would be good for ratings.
So if they, if an American journalist asked you for advice on how to cover Trump, what would be your advice?
But you need to be more specific. I mean, covering Trump is
okay. So specifically, I think the number one thing people want to do is interview a politician, whether it be Trump or any politician, mm-hmm. and cut through the BS, mm-hmm. Get them off their talking points,
sure.
right?
Yeah.
And Trump is probably the sort of now the paradigm of how at least politicians on the right talk to the press, right? Where you're the enemy.
Yeah.
You're trying to give me gotcha questions.
Yeah.
You're part of the liberal elite.
Sure.
So how do you deal with it?
Well, first of all, I think Trump is different, and I could make a whole argument that even if we would get the opportunity to interview Trump, we shouldn't do it.
Okay.
I think we eventually will, because the editors would say, you can interview, you have to, but there are many reasons not to interview Trump. But he's an outlier, and he's different than other right-wing politicians or left-wing politicians who may not tell the truth either. The difficult thing about covering Trump, if you are an American or a journalist and your outlet has influence, is that you don't get dragged into the mud, and that you don't fall in the trap of becoming an activist. Right. But if you do an interview with Trump and you correct every non-factual, every lie in his answers, then you do not have an interview, because then it becomes. I interviewed Steve Bannon,
okay.
Trump's advisor, and then he picked a fight from the beginning, and I wasn't prepared, and it was you didn't learn anything from the interview, because it was just him and me fighting, basically. The reason why Trump is different is because if he tells you something now, then tomorrow he'll say the complete opposite thing. Right. Whether it's on Ukraine or it's about abortion. Abortion is a good example. Trump has no idea how to handle abortion, which is a very important topic in these elections, and he just doesn't know. During his career, he's been pro-choice, pro-life, and everywhere in between, and he still doesn't know. And so, especially when it's in the middle of a presidential campaign, you interview a politician or a presidential candidate because you want to inform your viewers, right, about how this person looks at certain issues. With Trump, after the interview, you have no idea. All you learn is that he speaks very incoherently, which you already know.
Right.
So, no, but I recently I was at a journalism festival, and I spoke to Tim Sebastian, who was a very experienced, he's he's in his 70s, and he started BBC Hard Talk, which is a hardcore political interview. He's a really hardcore political interviewer. And I asked him the same question, would you interview Trump right now? And he said, after thinking for a bit, he said, I think I wouldn't, but my editors would say you have to, and I would.
Right. Yeah, because it seems he'll say every possible answer at some point.
Yeah.
But I'm curious then on the other side, would you interview Biden?
Yes, I would.
And how would you approach it?
Well, I don't know. It depends on the topic. But with Biden, I don't think so. Preparing an interview, and a while ago I interviewed the president of Herzog, which was a few months ago, and it was in the middle of this war, obviously. So it's a very sensitive issue, and so it's when you prepare such an interview, you write down your questions or what you think your questions will be. He'll answer like this. So if he answers this, then I have to do this as a follow-up question. So it's you can make a whole diagram of, if not every interview, but if it's an interview that which will be tough. And that's the approach you cannot use with Trump, because like I just explained, he'll go anywhere, all over the map. With Biden, it's different. In general, Biden would give coherent answers that you may or may not agree with, but that at least you understand what he's saying. He'll make mistakes because he's an old man who makes mistakes. But it'll be in general, it'll be just a political interview where some topics he will not want to address, or he'll stick to his his talking points, which may be frustrating. But at least it's a normal interview.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would interview Biden, and again, I would interview Trump. But there are many reasons not to. And with Biden, I don't see any reasons not to interview him unless you believe that, and I have some colleagues who believe that interviewing a politician is always a waste of time.
Yeah, because I've always been curious, because I see a lot of politicians be interviewed, and you can see on the face of the journalist, as much as they're trying to hide it, that mix of frustration and recognition of, they're playing the greatest hits. So
that happens. Yeah.
You know the talking point is coming, right?
Yeah.
And
not always, but often. Yeah.
You ask a question, abortion policy, what's your plan? And they say, in the United States we have beliefs, and they'll start going off, right? Yeah. But
you always have to have your counter question ready.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have X number of minutes, right? I assume you've been told by their press handlers, you're only getting 3 minutes, right?
Well, not 3, but like 15 would be the minimum.
Okay,
yeah.
But
and often the maximum.
Do you feel going in, that there's something you're trying to get them to say, something you're trying to get them to talk about, or is it just I have my set of questions, let's see where this goes?
No, you do. I mean, it depends on the interview, but usually you have 3 things you really want to get out of it. And it may be something really informative, like we haven't spoken about your plan for the future of Gaza. What is your plan? It may be because, and you can call that a gotcha question, or you just want to inform your viewers that this person, is either a hypocrite or just switch positions, which may happen, and sometimes for good reasons. We always blame politicians for taking another position than they did the year before, but frankly, I mean, sometimes people do. So you could applaud it. But there's always 3 things you want to take away, and if after the interview, and we spoke about it before, like for interviewing Bill Clinton, and Mark Rutte is the same, our former, I guess our current prime minister. I've interviewed him many times, and you would always come in, he's being so incoherent about Dutch policy towards Syria back at the time at the UN when I interviewed him, so he's not going to get away this time. But some politicians are so freaking skilled that they do get away.
Yeah.
And then you feel like it's a failed interview. But there are always a few things that you want to get out of an interview, and unlike popular opinion, I think it's not always the case that, or more often than not, it's not the case that a journalist wants to go into an interview hoping to completely tackle that person, and make his life miserable. That has happened.
Right.
But that's not, usually that's not how you go into an interview.
So I apologize. I am a philosophy professor. So
no, I apologize. I'm a journalist.
Why? It would be interesting which is worse. But I'm curious about the philosophy of what we're talking about. So if we take a step back and you say, I want to talk to a politician about their policy, right? So if you have Biden, you would want to ask him, Netanyahu, Putin, why do you treat one this way? Why that, right? But again, this idea that does this give a false, so because you said you wanted to inform the viewer, right? Does this give a false perception of what the actual role of President of the United States is? Because their thoughts, feelings, even their policy considerations, they're not king. So that's,
they're not what?
They're not the king.
Yeah, sure.
And even
you mean they have to deal with Congress and blah blah
right,
blah.
right.
Yeah,
so it's again this sort of it gives an impression, or does it give an impression that the president has a power, right? And I think this is again the sort of and I don't know the Dutch perception, but I think in America, because almost always the very first thing we say is most powerful man in the world. Right? Leader of the free world.
Yeah.
So does that line of questioning, where you want to, like, what do you think? What's your policy? What's your plan? I mean, how much does that even matter, right?
No, I understand the question, but it's really hard to answer that in a general sense. I mean, so let's say I would interview Biden about about Gaza, and I'll force him to say that when Israel attacks Rafah, then he would, day one, stop providing any weapon to Israel. I mean, he would never say that, but let's assume so. Then they would cut back to me or to another reporter who would then explain that Biden is not king and has to deal with Congress. So if you look at an interview in a vacuum, but it would be, that's our job. It would be really bad if you do interview him in a vacuum, and if the takeaway from the viewer is what you're just explaining, he's king, and then we didn't do our job properly. But I hope that the American president is not king, just like our prime minister has to deal with parliament. Our prime minister is less powerful, actually, then, because he doesn't have executive power like in some cases the American president does. So yeah, we would always, you're completely right, but we would always explain. The reader or the viewer still might get the wrong impression. I mean, we make many mistakes in journalism, but this should not be one of them.
Okay. Yeah, because it's so before I worked here, I worked in Congress in the United States.
I'm sorry.
And I was shocked to discover, because again, growing up in the United States, you don't learn anything about how America works. That the congressman, he would come in, say, "How am I voting?" They would tell him, and he'd leave. He didn't know what the bill was. He didn't know why he was voting yes or no. He just trusted his staff.
And he would vote in line with his party most of the time.
So his job, which again I didn't understand, was to raise money. That was his job. And then the legislative staff, of which I, an 18-year-old freshman in college, I was able to sign as the congressman on letters going to constituents about policy positions.
Which congressman was it?
This was in Massachusetts. This was Marty Meehan. So this would have been 1999. But again, it's how do we get away from that perception, right? That you have so much focus on elections, on who wins, but the staff behind them almost never gets talked about.
Right.
But it's the staff making the decisions.
Right.
So how can we have a functioning democracy? And if that's really the focus, right? Protecting democracy, journalism is
Without
a
really
pillar.
explaining what
Right.
how democracy works.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. The thing is, in the daily, I'm not a political journalist. I do sometimes interview politicians, but I don't work at the political, neither in Washington nor in The Hague. So this is not my daily business. But we always need to explain what's behind the curtain, and what you're describing right now, and I know it not from inside, but I know this is how it works because I covered Washington. To be honest, that's not a story I really told my viewers. You could make the argument that I should have. On the other hand, it's still no matter who tells them how to vote, it's the Congress people voting, and it's either this bill gets passed or it doesn't get passed, right? In general, it's always, and we did many stories about the fundraising, because you're right, 90% of the time they spend on fundraising, and 98% of the members of Congress are millionaire and get re-elected. And the influence of money on politics, that's something we should really keep explaining, et cetera, et cetera. But when I cover American elections or when I do documentary series on the US, I don't hang out with politicians a lot, and I go to, ordinary. I try to tell stories of ordinary Americans, even though that sounds, I never liked ordinary Americans, but it's, you know what I mean. So I would stay away from politicians, but try to show what the actual policies entailed in the states, etc.
Yeah.
But the more the viewer or the reader gets to know about how the sausage gets made, the better, obviously.
Right. Yeah, because it's again this fascinating. So if you start to explain, the role of money in politics, then this goes back to the how do you not sound like an activist?
Yeah.
So this is where it sounds like you get caught as a journalist between I want to inform people, but I don't want to sound biased.
Of course, and that's but you still need to inform people, and that's more important. And it's inescapable that, especially in these days, that you'll be accused of being biased. So you read the story about Ronald Plasterk here. NRC had a big story about him, his patents, and he was supposed to be the new prime minister. Now he's not, and people would say, that's a media hit job. No, it's not. They just did their work, and the person we're talking about decided to withdraw from the whole process. So we should not be afraid, we as journalists, and we should do all that stuff. But there's a line that you don't need to cross. You have to be careful, but that's sometimes just about the wording you choose or the phrasing you choose or whatever. Are journalists there to? Journalism is an important pillar of democracy. So obviously journalists are in favor of democracy. You could even make the argument that journalists should help protect democracy. That doesn't mean that journalists are on this planet to keep Donald Trump, assuming that he's the candidate that might hurt democracy the most for many reasons. It's not our job to make sure he's not elected. That's not at all our job. It's our job, and we'll never completely be successful at it, to tell I don't have any influence in America, but if I were an American journalist, it's my job to inform the American audience as much as we can about who these candidates are, how they look at several issues, and democracy obviously is probably the most important of them, but it's not our job to tell them how to vote.
But if you're so I guess the question is, well, let me put it another way. So how do you view democracy?
How do I view democracy?
Just very, very simple.
Oh, it's like...
So is it, well, let me put it in these terms. Is it procedural? So is it just we have elections, we have balance of power, we have, procedures, or is it that it actually has content to it? So this is a philosophy. We have content versus form, and I think when in America, I'm curious about the Dutch perception, but in America, when we say democracy, we typically think we have meat on the bone, but really we just mean
The bone.
election every 4 years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But we, talk about our freedoms, our rights, all these things. But again, this sort of standard, if the democratic process is all that matters, then you can get democratically elected tyrant, democratically elected fascist.
Sure.
So democracy can destroy democracy at any point.
Sure.
But if it has substance to it, then you could say, no, democracy can't be self-destructive. So that's why
What kind of substance do you mean? Because for me, democracy is both. It's procedural and it's substance, and the procedural also includes, it's, for instance, very important to talk about voter suppression, for instance, which I'm sure which I guess in your distinction you mean that's procedural, but it's very much a part of democracy, and it's important to cover, right? So what do you mean with the contents of democracy?
Right. So if you start saying things like, is money speech, right? Then this is where procedure and content start to merge.
Yeah.
So the Supreme Court deciding, to lift limits on content and the dark funding and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
But if you say something like, this is Karl Popper's famous paradox of tolerance, right? So the idea that if you tolerate anything and everything, then you tolerate hate, which will destroy tolerance. So he says, no, tolerance cannot tolerate the intolerant. So you can make a similar argument with democracy, that democracy has to defend itself against fascism, so it has to be opposed to certain things. So that's when, if you're substantively protecting democracy, and I think this is what I see a lot of American journalists getting into, when they say, no, we have to take a stand, right? So the Washington Post says democracy dies in darkness, right? Then it's not just procedural anymore, right? It's you have to be opposed to certain things.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to get at with you, is
yeah,
where do you stand on those things?
But are you, I will answer that question, but do you mean, because democracy dies in darkness was the catchphrase of the Washington Post after Trump got elected?
Right.
But do you consider that a good thing or a bad thing? Because that's on the verge of, it's not partisan, because you could say that just means that, it's about a free press. But it was pretty obvious, if Trump wasn't elected, then that phrase would not be there.
Right.
So do you consider that a journalist's task? Do you consider that a good thing, or does that make them partisan?
Well, that's what, again, it's complicated with someone like Trump, right? Yeah. So that what had been a bipartisan, we respect the press, is now partisan. And I think this is part of what gets American journalists and newsrooms confused about how to cover politics now, is that standard operating procedure of how to cover politics now is partisan.
Yeah. Well, is seen to be partisan.
But I think it just is partisan. So I don't think it's, if you try to speak truth in a climate of lies, then you're taking a side. Because then you're on the side of truth.
but why would that suddenly be a side? Yeah, but that's a very shallow way of looking at it, I think.
Right, but that's the kind of thing that I imagine, right?
Yeah.
That
if choosing truth, and we can agree, I guess there's no such thing as objectivity, but journalists always pretend to hide, truth, objectivity. So if choosing truth or getting as close to truth or objectivity as you can, if you mean that by choosing a side, then you pick a side. I wouldn't describe that as picking a side. Okay. Not even now, because Trump was still more the exception than the rule, right? For now, I mean, and politicians before Trump lied. I mean, not as much, but they lied, and Bush lied, and he harmed a lot more people because he set fire on the Middle East. So I mean, yeah, but it's a philosophical. Well, I guess you're a philosopher, so. But it's where if opting for truth is choosing a side. That's for me, that's too cynical. But
Okay, well, I do write a lot about cynicism.
and I like cynicism, but I'm not there yet.
Yeah, well, I'm glad one of us isn't. But it's again this sort of, so if...
But what would be? I am curious to what would be, because for me, let's just a few recent examples. What I would say is good journalism amidst this whole shitstorm. It could be ProPublica, which is a media outlet. They do a lot of, I think they do a lot of great stuff on, on democracy, but a lot of good investigative journalism, tracking money, which is in 90% of the time, that's what investors get. If you want to investigate politics, you have to follow the money, so that's what they do. But also the New York Times, who had a big story, I think, last week about one of the Supreme Court justices, who are supposed to be, even though we know they're not, but impartisan. They flew a January 6th Capitol storming a flag outside of their home. So basically in favor of those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th.
But he said it was his wife.
And he's saying it was my wife, yeah. These are two completely, but for me that's in tough times, that's good journalism, right? But would you agree, or would you say that's a focus on the completely wrong thing? I mean, it's just one example that suddenly comes to mind, but...
Yeah, no, I think the focus on Clarence Thomas, the focus on Alito, this is again how the press, at least in the United States, gets pulled into seeming partisan.
Yes, but should they then not write that story about that flag hanging outside?
So that's again, I'm curious about how the newsroom makes that decision.
No, but I'm curious about your answer.
Okay, well, I think...
I know philosophers only ask questions, but sometimes you have to answer them.
No, I think not only should that be the story, I mean, it should keep pushing and pushing and pushing.
Right. I agree.
And pushing to ask, why does the Supreme Court have the power it does?
Yeah,
why aren't we adding 3 more?
Yeah.
So it's again the sort of, I don't think in the United States, because we have 9 justices, we think, well, there has to be 9 justices. How could you have 12?
Because we have 9. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No.
And then when you find out, actually, there used to be reasons for this that were based on geography, and it's again one of these things that you sound like you're partisan, and I don't know.
You sound like you're partisan when you say what?
When you try to explain these things, because again,
for me that doesn't.
Because this is what I think even came out in your. The Battle of Florida docuseries, that episode again showed clearly, because this was the closing bit, right? The discussion with the professor of French and gender studies, where she said, I don't think Governor DeSantis cares about gender. I don't think he cares about race. I think he cares about keeping people uninformed, because an uninformed electorate keeps him in power. So then if your role is to inform people, that's partisan.
Again, I don't agree.
Right.
No, because I'm not, for me that's too cynical. We're still, if that was the case, then we would be we would think Trump is the new normal.
Right.
But we're still, even though we've been following him since 2015, we're still sometimes, what the fuck, and we're still shocked sometimes with what he says or does. So as long as Trump is not the new normal, I don't think posing normal journalistic questions is partisan, and that some assume that some say it's partisan doesn't mean they're right, for me.
Okay, because I think the issue is it's not just that you ask the question, right? Because they're going to lie to you, or at least spin.
Sure.
Right. That was our old fun word for it.
Yeah.
So to again inform the audience, you have to either cut them off and set the record straight.
The politicians, you mean?
Right.
Yeah.
You'd have to cut them off and say, no, that's not how this works.
Yeah.
Or you would have, okay, the interview ends, and now let's explain, you have the pundit at the desk.
Yeah, that's not ideal.
Right.
I would not opt for that second option.
And again, it seems like the Republican Party playbook is to turn the press into the opposition party.
For sure.
And so they want you to start informing the public, because then they say, aha, you're against the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Because we're not informing the public. We're disinforming the public.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah.
So it's again this sort of, if you
But that
hear...
doesn't make you, for me, that doesn't make you partisan. I mean, the whole definition of, I guess for you, the whole definition of partisanship has shifted a lot more than, I'm more confident in what we as journalists or academics or so can do. I know they want us to become partisans, and I know there's sometimes a risk of becoming partisan, but no, I'm not. We just do our jobs and we start investigating and exposing all this. Yes, they would call the media partisan, and that's just the way it is.
Right. Like earlier we were talking about Winston Churchill, and he was a master of misinformation. So you can imagine that if there was members of the press in England 1941 who were trying to inform the public, or even earlier 1914, trying to inform the public, World War I not going well for the British, right? He would have said, you can't do that, and there would have been official censorship. And there would have been a clear opposition between the duty of the journalist and the duty of wartime nationalism, whatever. So I'm again curious, because tonight we're supposed to talk about the next U.S. presidential election. The closer it gets, the more people are getting into the apocalyptic Alex Garland Civil War mindset.
Sure.
Where it sounds like if the press is not, like you said, I'm not trying to keep Trump out of office. But you can imagine to people in the public saying, but everyone should be trying to keep Trump out of office, right? Existential threat.
Yeah, Democrats would say that, yeah.
So it's again this sort of, if you're not trying to do that, and you are trying to uphold democracy, and you're trying to inform the electorate, but you have a candidate who wants to destroy democracy and not inform the electorate, then how are you not an opposition party?
No, maybe but you don't have to take the bait and say out loud that you want this president gone.
Right.
I mean, why would you get tempted to do that?
But it's not that you have to say you want him gone. It's that as soon as you say, I want to defend democracy, I want to defend the world order, I want peace, then that's already, I don't want Donald Trump.
Yeah, but that's a conclusion then that the reader should draw.
Okay.
And maybe no, but it's a good and maybe that's an argument not to put "when democracy dies in darkness" as your slogan. So that's valid point. I mean, I'm not saying the Washington Post should have done that. I think some outlets like CNN had a report on the White House. He was showing off too much, Jim Acosta against Donald Trump, and it was always, it was always more about the outlet than about. No, I think if you're just below the radar or until the product is finished, you do your job and you come up with all of these stories. I mean, we're not flawless, not at all, but and sometimes we go in the overdrive. I mean the whole Russia conversation that Trump was bought by Russia, which. Not there's still some untold stories there, but obviously the big Trump-Russia conspiracy, the big chunk of it was not true.
Right.
Many journalists from many left-wing outlets, they completely fell for it. And they really did their profession a lot of harm, which is swinging in the other direction, right? So I would say always under-promise, over-deliver, expose as much as you can, which is, again, that's often about money trails and then let the voter decide. Because, and if that is considered activist, then so be it. But don't take the bait. because it's even if journalism is imperfect, it's still better than having both camps and the aligned media, tell their own versions of America, which is more and more of what's happening. If you read the I don't think you cannot call the New York Times the Fox News of the left. So the New York Times is more in the middle, but even though many Republicans would disagree, but if you watch MSNBC all day long, your image of America is just as not just as flawed, but pretty flawed as well. Not as much as Fox News, which is basically brainwashing, but MSNBC is not great either. So anyway, there's no until somebody comes up with something better than journalism, which I'm happy, something that pays better than journalism. But until that time, journalism is what people need to stick to, I guess.
Well, that's the pivot to video, right?
That's the pivot to video.
Yeah. So so to move off Trump to someone worse, Mark Zuckerberg, if you follow the money, right? So we have this program here, PSTS, Philosophy, Science, Technology, and Society. And one of the key texts from the 50s talks about how technology basically made democracy irrelevant. So again, the idea, if tech companies have so much political power, again, the question of, does the focus on elections, the focus on politicians, sort of actually miss how politics is actually working today?
Well, only if reporters do not look at Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and TikTok and Instagram, etc. But I hope they do. I mean, we do, not to. I mean, it's the cheapest answer I could give is to tell you what my program did. But we did recently go to Indonesia to show the impact of fake news and algorithms and TikTok on the outcome of the presidential elections there. So I think we should, because it's a very important point. Also, with a lot of liberals would say the Cambridge Analytica scandal decided the election for Trump. Well, we now know that the Cambridge Analytica, correct me if I'm wrong, because you probably know more about this than I do, but I think the impact of Cambridge Analytica was minor on the outcome of the elections. But anyway, no, these are stories, but they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, we should tell both these stories. But if your overall point is that journalism focuses too much on the on those allegedly in power, on the politicians, I agree. But as long as we keep doing stories in election time on these platforms as well, I think you need to do both.
Yeah.
Because you cannot only focus on the platforms and just ignore what these politicians say. Because I don't think, Facebook can help swing an election, but I still don't think Facebook decides an election.
But you have
you still need living, breathing politicians,
right,
or people close to that, like Trump
close
and Biden.
to that. So in the United States, we used to have newspapers across the United States that had very big staffs that were able to cover local politics.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. And again, this is something that tech companies have been doing, right? So the Facebook
first the classifieds and then
move your news to us, we'll drive you traffic, and it was a lie, right?
No, terrible.
So
bad for democracy.
Cambridge Analytica, their scandal was based on their access to Facebook, which again is a distraction from the role that Facebook has in things like destroying journalism in America. So you now have AI writing stories in newspapers, and this seems to be the real threat. But in the news, you see AI covered as, is this great? Is it not? Who knows? So we try to inform the public again, right? But it's how do you get at that intersection about and without again sounding like a conspiracy theorist, where you're trying to connect the dots, that when Google announces this, when Facebook announces this, when Microsoft announces this, that's maybe actually more important than Trump or Biden. And how do you,
It's a boring answer, and I feel almost bad about saying that, but you need to do both.
Right.
And this is all. I know this sounds so defensive, but I can answer your question honestly. That you need to do both. And the program I work for, we did a whole investigative piece 2 weeks ago about how ChatGPT, so this is the AI, how they promised to. This is not a perfect solution to your problem. We should do a lot more. But how these companies promised, and also Google and Microsoft, that these ChatGPT kind of programs could not be used for political purposes, writing campaign slogans, that kind of stuff, campaign strategies. And we and other American journalists as well, we tried all this, and it doesn't work. It doesn't function like the way they. So this was a story or a whole investigation basically about how AI is being misused for political campaigns. How these companies did not stick to their own principles, how they changed those, at least some, after we informed them, and how this is something we should still keep an eye on towards the June 6 to 9 European elections. I guess we can do that a lot more, but the reason you know about this is because you read it in an outlet somewhere.
Because I do feel like we've talked about how would you interview Biden, how would you interview Trump, but maybe it's more how would you interview Sam Altman?
Yeah, maybe, but you didn't ask me that question.
Exactly. But I do wonder again about.
It's a good question. I would love to interview Sam Altman.
Yeah. So how you look at God, I can't remember the name. The journalist who followed him around wrote a book about him. The guy who wrote Moneyball.
Oh yeah, guy in the West Coast.
And he was so.
Yeah, he's a great author.
But
Michael something.
Yeah, and he's now still defending Altman. And Sam.
Is he really? I didn't.
And Sam Bankman-Fried, and it's again this sort of.
He wrote a book on Sam Bankman-Fried.
Yeah, so you get this sort of mind warp when you spend time with these people, and I've spent time with these tech people. Yeah. And you get again very political. Yes, we're trying to fix that. Yes, we know. Yes, we're deeply concerned. 3 to 5 years away is the answer.
Yeah.
And I'm frankly more worried about what tech companies are doing to the planet.
Yeah.
Because so again, ChatGPT, the focus has been things like, is it a stochastic parrot? Is it hallucinating? But the amount of coverage on its role in climate change, right? That these data centers are destroying the planet. So here on our campus, we're no longer allowed to fly. We're supposed to take trains, buses, whatever possible. But at the same time, we're allowed to use AI. And when you look at charts about the carbon footprint of a New York to San Francisco round-trip flight, and then ChatGPT. So it's again the sort of, how do we connect those dots, right? And how do we move that from, in American press at least, I don't know about Dutch press, it's often you have the politics section and you have the technology section.
Yeah.
But
should be one section.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's good. That's a very good point. And it's also a good point that once you're in. So I interviewed Walter Isaacson about his book on Musk, and Musk is, it's one of the most terrible people on this planet. I guess we can agree. And he did, what Twitter's doing or X is doing to politics. It's terrible. But Walter Isaacson, who's a famous biographer who wrote a book about Einstein and about, well, not sure about Einstein, Leonardo da Vinci and Steve Jobs, and he was obviously, and maybe I would feel the same if I spent so much time in the orbit of Elon Musk. The book is sometimes a bit critical, but most of the time he's in awe of Elon Musk. So that is a risk, and it may be the same with we should cover all these tech guys, and that's another thing, but completely unrelated, but not entirely. All the European correspondents, including me when I was a correspondent, everybody's based on the East Coast. you could also argue that it's better to be on the West Coast because you get the talking points of the politicians anyway, or they wouldn't speak to you if you're Dutch television. On the West Coast, maybe you would not also speak to Sam Altman, but there are a lot of smart people you could interview or talk to or investigate. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Okay. I was just going to say that. Okay. All right. I've heard the voice of God. It's time for. So yes, if you have questions, please. Something's happening, but is there a microphone? Okay. So yes, if you have a question, raise your hands, and we will get a microphone to you.
No, one more.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so far for a very interesting interview. I was kind of wondering on the topic of, what you should do as a journalist to inform the people. I tend to believe that in the Netherlands, and I think in the USA it's maybe even worse, but there's a lot of focus on the day-to-day, things that happen instead of on the policies. There's hardly any, articles, videos, whatever you want to call it, about policies. And shouldn't journalism also try to uncover these policies for all these politicians, and by doing that also try to focus more on these instead of letting the politicians decide on what should be covered?
But do you have an example? Because I'm not sure. Maybe I agree with you, but I need to hear something more specific.
I'm referring to, for example, in the last general elections in the Netherlands, there was a program, I believe it was from RTL, but it was only broadcasted through YouTube, I believe, which put some topics, policy topics like climate or asylum and stuff like that, as a topic, and then just stated where all these parties were positioned regarding that topic and what their policies was, etc. There wasn't any right or left or center opinion. It was just reflecting what these parties in the Netherlands were thinking about these policies. So you can fill out the questionnaire online, and then you get where you probably would end up and where the parties are. But these kind of programs actually served to me more like something that really informed me. And I'm missing that in general, and especially in the USA.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I get your point, and I agree a bit. I think but no, help me with this. But the American and the Dutch media landscapes are different. I do agree, if that's what you mean, that especially in the run-up to elections, that I mean, we have a lot of debates, and most of the time they're useless. I think, and my program does that. But debates among politicians are 90% of the time basically useless, I think. It's like performance, but it's nothing substantial. To be honest, I'm a voter as well, and I could base my vote on in the Netherlands. In the US, I would be less optimistic. But in the Netherlands, if I find climate important, I mean, not if I do find climate important. Poverty among kids or whatever, I could find many articles, but maybe you and I disagree, or we watch different stuff, but I could find many articles or news reports informing me about that. I'm not saying that the balance is great, but from kieswijzers online to quality newspapers in the Netherlands, I do think there's too much of a focus on the horse race, and there always has been. But if you compare it to the US, I'm a little more optimistic, I guess, about you than you are about what you can read or get to inform yourself.
Thank you for the interesting conversation first. I was wondering, what do you think are the biggest obstacles to both presidential campaigns?
You mean right now for Biden and Trump? Or?
Yes, perhaps Kennedy as well, but I think that's the brain worm.
Sorry?
For Kennedy as
RFK.
well,
Oh,
perhaps.
that's a brain worm, yeah. So there are a few things. What I find intriguing, even though it's obviously very sad, but I really wonder how the Gaza war and the campus protests and the Arab American population in Michigan, the cliche, but Michigan is a swing state with a lot of Arab Americans, how that impacts the election. And I'm always, the White House, they don't pick up when I call them, but from the American publications, they seem very optimistic, and you always need to sound optimistic as a political campaign, but it would worry me more than it seems to worry them. Obviously, age is a thing. That's also a thing, by the way. That's a thing. Biden is a bit older than Trump, but if you look at the American media. If you just read the New York Times, even you don't realize, you almost get the impression that what Biden says is a lot more incoherent than what Trump says. Well, let me spoil it for you. It's not. He makes mistakes, but it's nothing compared to Trump. If Trump starts a sentence, even he himself has no idea how that sentence is ending, and he can contradict himself 4 times within that sentence. And that's just a factual statement, but the bar for Biden apparently is so much higher. Anyway, it's an issue he has to deal with, whether it's right or not. He's old and he stumbles and he makes mistakes and he makes mistakes every day, and the bar for Trump somehow is so much lower. The problem, the main problem for Trump, I think, but I wonder how Nolan feels, is that so he has this 40% of the electorate would never dump Trump, maybe a few when he's convicted, but he has this very solid base. But so I guess the Americans say he has a high floor, but also a low ceiling, in the sense that there's also a big group of voters that he never seems to reach. And Trump needs to, so the people, for instance, that during the primaries voted for Nikki Haley, his opponent, she's been out of the race for months. But whenever there's a primary, because the primaries are not over, she would still get 25% of the vote, even though the people who vote for her know that she's not in the race anymore, and she may even endorse Trump. So that's a problem for her. I think Biden still has more voters that he could potentially grab when American voters really tune in, because right now, political junkies follow it, but most of the voters are not really tuned in yet. But obviously the economy is something that traditionally, like foreign policy, those are issues that Republican candidates tend to do better at. And the economy, the big problem for Biden is that the economy has been doing well, unemployment, etc. Not inflation, but most of the economic, by most measures. But for years now, he hasn't been able to get the to get the credits for it, and that's if in November that's still the case, he has a big problem. But I really wonder how you look at it.
Yeah, no, I think everything you said I agree with. The biggest hurdle for Biden is people not voting.
Yeah.
The biggest hurdle for Trump is people voting.
Yeah.
So it's really that simple.
Yeah.
I mean, if what's happening right now with the Middle East goes the way it seems like it's going, Americans will. It's not that they'll suddenly switch and vote for Trump. It's that they'll stay home.
Yeah.
And we already have, compared to other countries like the Netherlands, we have almost no voting anyway. We're lucky if we get close to 50%. So we could have also had a whole discussion about, how to get people to vote, period. And again, the question of if journalists are trying to get people to vote, which is again part of the democracy, is it procedural or is it substantive? Yeah. Then again, that puts you in the Democrat Party and not the Republican Party.
I mean, the cliche is, I guess, it's a turnout election, right? But I guess that cliche is more true now than ever. It is about turnout and about people showing up, and the weather can make the difference on November 5 or what is it? No, it's.
Hey, so obviously the American political scene is monopolized by these two big parties, and I wanted to know three things. In your opinion, is this a bad thing, good thing?
That there are only two parties.
Basically, yes. Does the attention that the media put on them perpetuate this division and this monopoly? And lastly, what can we do to actually move away from this?
Yeah, it's very good. Three very good questions. First of all, yes, I do think it's a problem. There are many more parties in America, probably more than here, but you know, RFK, it's an independent candidate. You have the Green Party and the Reform Party, but you're right, they're completely they exist, but they're not relevant. Do the media perpetuate? Yeah, the media made that problem bigger. Also, there are only two. Well, I mean, it's a how do you call it? It's a chicken and egg kind of thing. Yes, there are only two parties, so the other parties don't get attention, so they don't get money, so they don't get voters, so they don't get attention, right? But the media obviously have a responsibility there. Money is the issue. So the media can, because your third question was, what can we do about it? If you consider it unhealthy, and I do consider it unhealthy, I'm not saying the Dutch system with 17 or 18 parties in parliament is ideal, but yeah, I mean, more media attention for these minor parties would help, but they would not solve the problem. RFK Jr. actually got a lot of media coverage, not as much as Trump and Biden, but he'll still never. He may be the spoiler candidate, but we don't know for which party. Then I think he would hurt Trump more than Biden, but I'm not even entirely sure. Yeah, but the thing is, and Nolan mentioned it, all the congressional candidates that. All they do is fundraise. A lot of that money will go into the coffins of the candidate, but also a lot of it will go to the parties. I don't know how to tackle how to answer that question, how to tackle the problem. I don't know if you have a good idea, but it's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's again weird that the founding fathers of the United States did not want political parties, so you weren't even supposed to have campaigning. It was considered ungentlemanly. So it's the election of 1800, where Aaron Burr, if you've seen the Hamilton musical, you've heard of Burr. It's on Disney Plus. It's great. So he literally went door to door campaigning and basically invented American campaigning on the spot. So it's ever since then their parties have formed. And I am curious because the Democrat Party is seen as the big tent party. So again, this idea that there's two parties, but within those two parties, there are X number of parties. So it's unclear, when you have a party that has Joe Biden, but also Bernie Sanders, but also Joe Manchin, but also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. How many Dutch parties would that be?
All
right?
of them.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
I think the 15 of the 18 or 19 Dutch parties would fit into the Democratic Party.
So it's again one of these. If you start, because I've been following Dutch politics, not in Dutch, but to the degree I can. Once you have to build a coalition, and you have four parties coalescing. Are they still four parties, or are they becoming a super party? And again, is it, going back to the chicken and egg question, does America actually, and do America and the Netherlands actually have a very similar process? They just doesn't look the same because there has to be coalition building. And so, when Trump won in 2016, you had Republicans having President, House, Senate. But they couldn't get anything done. They got tax cuts for the wealthy and job done for 4 years. So it seemed like everyone's nightmare scenario of like, oh my God, the Republicans are going to steamroll America. It didn't happen because they couldn't stop fighting with each other. And now the Democrats are in power and they can't stop fighting with each other, right? So it is a question of, the two-party system even true? I mean, it's not clear. I don't know. And it's quite possible, you know, the UK, similar to the Netherlands, has multiple parties, but it's Labour and the Tories. So I'm also curious to what degree that's true here, that it's like, yeah, you have all of these parties, but at the end of the day, how many parties are there really, right? So I don't know if the answer could be I need more parties, or if it's just we need a completely different system,
Right.
period.
Right.
Some questions over here. You're the first.
At one point in time, you were talking about like money and tech companies. Would you say that corporate America and like tech companies have a bigger influence on voters than like journalists? And if so, does that put the existence of journalists in America and maybe even in the Netherlands, because it's something that's upcoming here as well, under pressure?
You want to take that?
Oh, sure. Yes, yes. So tech companies, I mean, it's again the sort of, if you're getting your news through a technological medium, which I assume you are, then tech companies control the news. So do you watch on TV? But is that, you know, so if I'm watching NewsHour, I'm watching it on my Apple TV and on my NPO app, right? Or my NOS app. So I don't know to what degree Apple, the app developers, that they can actually influence not only what I perceive, but how I perceive it, right? And I think this is a serious problem, you know, after 2016, fake news became standard lexicon, right? But again, the question, well, where's the fake, right? So is it that the journalist is making stuff up? Is it that Facebook is making stuff up, Twitter, TikTok? Is it the people posting it, right? So in the United States, right before the 2016 election, the biggest news story was a Denver Guardian article that said, breaking news, proof Hillary Clinton had Seth Rich murdered. And this story got more hits than the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, basically any newspaper in America. And this was right before the election. And the biggest problem wasn't that the story doesn't exist. The Denver Guardian doesn't exist.
Right.
That's not a newspaper. So it was completely invented website, but it got millions of hits, right? So again, tech companies, tech platforms have such an outsized influence so that, you know, it's not about our journalists doing their jobs, but again, how much their job depends on technology and how that, you know, you can't avoid that, right? So journalists can't go door to door and say, here's the news today. But until journalists are doing that, you're going to have a technological medium between you and the journalism. So it's, again, I don't know how you get rid of that. But I also don't know how much people even know that, right? Like there was a researcher in Kansas who was doing a psychological study on Facebook users and the Facebook news feed. And she wanted to know, you know, how much people understood the role of the Facebook algorithm in newsfeed. And she said that for a lot of people, this was like the Matrix. They didn't know there was an algorithm. So she was, you know, blowing their minds. They had no idea. They just thought if you go on Facebook, you see what your friends are posting. And if friends disappear, they died. And if they reappear, oh my God, right? So it's again, you know, this is, I think, part of the problem also about being in a technological country like the Netherlands. So I went to Japan last year, and you know, my colleagues and I were like, oh my God, you guys love robots, you love technology. And they're like, what are you talking about? The Dutch love technology, not us. And they're like, plus, we learned it from you. But that's the 17th century. But again, this idea of if you take for granted a certain technology literacy, a certain technology savviness, then again, this question of does the journalism talk about it at this level, at this level, at this level? How do you educate the electorate when the electorate isn't on the same education level? So I don't even know how you begin to explain what technology is doing. Anyway, I'm rambling now. But
No, it's very
Yes.
valid point.
So my question was, why was there no real Democratic primary? Like Biden has been this for like a couple of years now, and there has been now no like real Democratic candidates who think.
That's also democracy. Yeah, a flaw of democracy. Yeah, I mean there has been a primary, but you're right. It was there was one I think one Dean Phillips or one candidate running against Biden. I mean it's common. I think 81 or something was the last time which it didn't happen, but it's common that if a president wants to run again, that he usually does that unopposed, because running against your own president would create a schism. These are all the cliches in the party, etc. I mean, the bigger question is, why did the Democrats choose Joe Biden in the first place in 2020? Well, there were many younger Republicans running against him. Cory Booker, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, who was supposed to be the new Obama, but dropped out before Iowa even though she had, she was from the tech coast and had the money and all the sponsors and shit. But eventually it was between Sanders and Biden, and they were both in their, I don't know, 130s. So, but eventually again, and that, I think that also has to do with money, but eventually the party eventually decides, and the party decided to move behind Biden, also because he has a lot more. I mean, Bernie Sanders in the Netherlands would be a pretty moderate candidate, but in the US he was too much of a risk and also too much of a status quo destroyer, right? Then Biden is the safest choice. But once Biden got into office, it's really hard to get him out, because it's, I don't know if you have anything to, but you don't run against a president of your own party in general, right?
No, like you said, Dean Phillips tried, and it became laughable. So yeah, I don't know, because again, this is part of the the staff behind. So I also don't know, if Biden dropped dead and Kamala Harris became president, how much things would change. Yeah. If Pete Buttigieg resigned and ran against, I don't know how much would change. So again, this is why part of my worry in my line of questioning earlier about the focus on, well, who's the president versus who's the staff.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you both very much for a very, very fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed that. I'm trying to find out, and I would like to hear both your views on this, whether indeed, let's say, the rise of populism on the one hand and the rise of tech platforms on the other hand, jointly, now together form such a major threat to democracy that even journalists like yourself, Eelco, and colleagues, are no longer able to confront politicians that use those two mechanisms to influence reality and to change the world. If you read Antonio Scurati's pamphlet on fascism and populism, if you read the journalist in the Netherlands, Tom-Jan Meeuwis, about his essay in philosophy about what is honesty and what is not, where do journalists stand? Do you still see a chance? I mean, is there still an option, a possibility to educate the electorate, or are we already too far gone? And if that is the case, things look very bad. So, is it sufficient to speak truths about power, if you see what I mean? Or do we need to take an ethical position, a moral position, and then confront? And in the end up in an elitist society?
Yeah, well, I guess the latter is more what you would propose. I guess I'm a little more optimistic in the sense that, and you're right, Tom-Jan Meeuwis wrote a great, is this still here? Yeah, wrote a great book, or the essay Duidelijkheid, about populism, etc. I'll remain optimistic until I see that, and I mean this not from a partisan point of view, but from a from somebody who appreciates democracy. As long as Trump is the outlier, then I think journalism first of all needs to continue to look in the mirror, and answer these difficult questions if we're doing the right thing. But I think journalism still has lots of tools to inform the public, and tech companies are not just evil. They provide us with a lot of tools also to inform the public. They provide us with a lot of tools to research data, or to do OSINT journalism, or the same tech companies that we find horrible and that I do find horrible offer us the chance to really, do OSINT work and show the devastations in Gaza or in the kibbutzes on October 7th. So anyway, but that's basically besides the point. No, it's something. I think this is in that sense the hardest time for journalism. Even though there've always been autocrats, and Trump is not the worst. There are many, and Trump was still elected through a democratic process, etc., etc. So I'm not that optimistic, but we need to be more vigilant than ever. It's a bit of a boring answer, but it's my answer.
Yeah, but I think it's again, you mentioned Elon Musk earlier. He's got the satellites that Zelensky and Ukraine are using, and he, just for fun, turned them off, right? And then he just sort of shows his power, right? And again, this is part of the discussion about democracy, and nobody elects tech CEOs. But the amount of power they have, real political power. So there was a big story, I think it was the New York Times, where they were talking to, again, average voter, diner, the kind of thing you'd do in America. So they're talking to people in Wisconsin, because Wisconsin's a swing state. And this guy said, I only have a job because Microsoft is building a new data center in Wisconsin, and that's because Biden got them to put a $3 billion data center in Wisconsin. That's why I have a job. And I said, okay, so who are you voting for? Trump. So that became the story, right? About how even people who owe their job to Biden, again, that story of the economics, how do you get the economic story across? But it was missing the fact that it's Microsoft putting the data center that helps Biden have that story in the first place. And there was something similar with Trump and Foxconn, that they were supposed to be putting a factory in Wisconsin, and then they pulled out. So again, tech companies can swing elections. And I don't think the electorate understands that, right? So like our students, when they graduate, they want to get jobs at tech companies. And we, as faculty, have to apply for grants. And how do I apply for a European grant? I have to get industry as part of my grant. So how critical can I be of my partner on the grant, right? So it's not even about journalists and politicians. It's about the entire system is infused with tech, right? I mean, our motto, high tech, human touch, right? So we had an AI and education committee. I said, ChatGPT is destroying education. And everyone said, no, we're a tech-focused university. We embrace technology. So it's infused in our way of thinking, right? That the tech companies, there might be a bad guy at the top, but if we get our students in there, then they'll change the world, right? Google, I remember, put an office in the city center a few summers ago, and they could just sort of drop a trailer and have a hiring thing, and people just flock to it because it's Google, and how exciting, right? They're in Enschede. So I don't know how we get people to understand how politics works today, when again the big talk is Trump Biden 2024. because that's just not how politics works anymore.
Another question.
Yes. Thank you. Considering the time, we will have to round up. So we will ask you, at a certain point during your talk, you also mentioned that the Dutch media still makes also a lot of mistakes when covering US politics. So what is a concrete takeaway for us as news consumers to consider while consuming Dutch media news about the US?
Right. That's a good. Did I phrase it that way? Jesus, I have to really think about this. Help me. I'm sure you saw something. No, I guess I mean in general, but it's a fair question because now I need to come up with an example. I was just trying to say that journalism is hard and we make mistakes, or we make a lot of them. I don't think, and I think one of them, and the gentleman was, I think we always need to be aware of focusing too much on the performance and on the performance artists, which are the politicians. So I'm guilty as charged when I cover presidential elections in the US and I have a few minutes to do my story, then yeah, I'm sure I focus too much on the politicians as well. And they want that because especially American politics, it's tailor-made for television and for quick sound bites, etc. So I cannot come up with a specific example, but my takeaway when I return from a reporting trip, and I try to be self-critical, is always that, did I choose the right topics, and did I focus too much on the circus, and did I focus not enough on the on the understream of what's actually going on. Yeah.
One final question, then we go to the drinks. Here you are.
Hi.
Hi.
So what I've noticed overall is that it's the political landscape in the Netherlands, but also in the USA, has really segregated a lot. You've seen a lot of differences, and they become increasingly larger. And I think my main question is, we've also, for example, seen, I would say, for example, countries like China, they have one political party, and they have, let's say, yearly or 10-year plans, 25-year plans. How do we, instead of looking at all of the differences between parties, how do we bring them together? How do we close the bridge? How do we bring forward democracy as a whole instead of segregating it even more?
You mean, and also how do you stop polarization, for instance?
Yeah. How do we move forward as one instead of as separate groups?
An interesting, there's this group, I'm not sure, it was called Common Angels or something. I don't, maybe it was a group that saw the polarization in the US, blue states, red states, etc. And they tried to, and they brought people together, and they were traveling the nation basically, and they really brought people together, like hardcore Republicans and hardcore Democrats in places like that. They would sit around a table like this and discuss these issues, and then they would find out, it's very cliche and very simple, but that they would find out that they had a lot more in common than they thought they did. On some issues like abortion, you could, but you could be either firmly pro-choice or pro-life, but there was still more common ground than you expect. I guess one answer is, but then I would lose my job, get rid of all mass media, because obviously the mass media are making this problem bigger. That's simply the case. And I'm just saying that, but America has 300 million people, so you put everybody in one spot. But it's, once people do connect, even though they stop talking, even within families, they stop talking to each other, but once they do, without the, turn the telly off, etc., then there's more. But that won't happen. So that's not a realistic answer to your question. I don't think there is a real solution for polarization except for what we've already. I mean, knowing what the problem is, and the tech companies is one of them, and the media plays a role as well. That's one of the problems, but. It's also a certain generation of politicians that and especially that after Trump, that know that they can win elections with this kind of with this kind of behavior. So if the politician has no moral compass or whatsoever, it sounds crazy, but then it would help if people entering politics would actually enter politics with some kind of moral compass. I know that sounds terrible, but it's true. And I'm not saying that no politician has it. I think many of them do, but I know that many of them don't.
Yeah, it's also strange, and this was something I'd meant to get to earlier, was how much of American politics, I don't know if this applies to Dutch politics, but how much of American politics is sports? And you support your team. But the players, so like in America, we famously have, I'm from Boston, so we were with the Red Sox, we hated the Yankees, and we would try to literally kill each other. And then we found out that the Red Sox and Yankees players were best friends. And so Jerry Seinfeld had a joke about, you're just rooting for laundry. It's whoever's wearing the shirt, that's it, right? And I think there's like similar actually in politics. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Anthony Scalia, who are diametrically, polarizingly opposed politically, best friends. And you hear this a lot. Bernie Sanders will talk about, oh, my friends across the aisle, and he means that literally. He has friends across the aisle. And there are Democrats like Joe Manchin, who he would choke to death if he did, right? And there are Republicans, again, one of these, what unites Democrats and Republicans? Everybody hates Ted Cruz, right? So there are things that everyone can agree on in Congress. But the people at home, right, the voting public, we have our team flag, just like, Eurovision, you vote.
Don't mention Eurovision. It's,
yeah.
It's too soon.
Right.
Sensitive.
But it's again, I have Dutch colleagues who say, oh, I don't care about the Netherlands. And then the World Cup comes along, Eurovision comes along, oh my God, right? But then every Koningsdag, all you hear is American music everywhere. So it's again this sort of, I don't know, because like you said, people agree far more than they disagree. So if they, so Hannah Arendt, for example, the political philosopher, said that, politics isn't elections, right? So Karl Marx said, Americans only have freedom of speech once every 4 years. Because we forget that politics is every day, every minute of the day, right? And so if we reduce politics to procedure, to voting, then we ignore politics 364 days right? So again, this idea of, we actually agree, we're not that far apart, but whenever our sports opportunity arises, we try to kill each other, and that's what the media focuses on, because that's the spectacle. So that's then the perspective, and again, it's that chicken and egg, it's feeding itself. But if you take any group of Americans and put them on a cruise ship, they're not going to care about their politics. They're going to say, I'm American. So it's again, an interesting, how much of this is perception and how much is reality, which is a whole other issue to talk about.
Yeah. Nolan and Eelco, we have to round off. And I will have very, very big hands for Eelco Bosch van Rosenthal and Nolan Good. Thank you very much.